Yeah, I think that's now working. So, right effort. The whole structure of this series of presentations is based on one sutra that I've been focusing on, which takes the view that right view is the forerunner, and right view, effort, and mindfulness run around the others, circle around the others. And it puts us in a place that's a little different from the way one normally approaches these. At least it feels that way to me. And it feels like an approach focused more on method than on the particular. A lot of the time, the conversations about the Noble Eightfold Path, we focus on fairly specific things, and there's a lot of conversation about action, speech, and to some extent livelihood. And we breezed through those very quickly last week, right? So the approach here is one that feels to me much more about method. And with method, it's like just do it and trust it, trust the process. I think of a couple of things with my, many points in my life. There's like in the vocation that I no longer really engage in. We had some technical tools. There's like these applications where you work them and you just get used to using them, and you use them, and they work really well, and they deliver the right results. I've just got a wonderful little book that's teaching me how to draw with the right side of my brain, which is something I stopped doing when I was a kid. And again, it's quite simply amazing. It just tells you do this, and you do it. It's like, wow, that's actually pretty good. So just trust the method. So a lot of this is about really just trusting the method. So right effort. Effort is important. This is another book, The Wings of Awakening by Thanissaro, who's the guy who wrote the book that I'm mostly using. And I picked this one up because he lists the 37 wings of awakening. If you look at the Samyutta Nikaya, which is the volume in the Pali Canon which focuses most clearly on the detailed teachings, on the particular practical teachings. In the last section of that, the particular approaches and tools that he talks about are covered. And of course, there's the Noble Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths of the Noble Eightfold Path. But there are several others. There are the 4 frames of reference, also 4 foundations of mindfulness. The 4 right exertions, also 4 right strivings, or 4 right efforts, which are to stop doing things that are unskillful, to not do things that are unskillful, haven't yet arisen, and then the reverse for skillful things. So that's 4 efforts out of 37 right there. And if you run through the rest, we have the 4 bases of power, developing the base of power endowed with concentration founded on desire, and the fabrications of exertion, founded on persistence, and the fabrications of exertion, founded on intent, founded on discrimination, and the fabrications of exertion. Last time I looked it up, exertion is kind of effort. 5 faculties and the 5 strengths, they're basically the same list of 5, and the second in those is persistence. So, I mean, it shows up in all of these lists. Effort is something that is really a heavy center here. And it makes sense if you think about it from a process standpoint. We've got to be working on this. So there's a shift in the sutra that I've been using, which structurally it goes through view, resolve, action, or speech, action, livelihood, and for each of them it does view as the forerunner, the other 3 circle around. Here's what wrong is, here's what mundane right is, here's what transcendent right is. So when we get to effort, and then also for mindfulness and for concentration, that approach shifts. It actually doesn't talk about those 3 in the same way at all. And specifically, there's no definition of wrong effort. And there's no real segregation of effort into mundane and transcendent. So it's different. What we've got is those four, right? I'll read them. So we should have those in our minds or in our ears. Where are we? So the way he words them here, generating desire, endeavoring, arousing persistence, upholding and exerting one's intent for the sake of, non-arising of unskillful qualities that have not yet arisen, abandoning of unskillful qualities that have arisen, arising of skillful qualities that have not yet arisen, and maintenance, non-confusion, increase, plenitude, development, and culmination of skillful qualities that have arisen. So that last one kind of gives a clue as to the direction I think this takes, which is there's a whole series of verbs there ending in culmination. They're not really verbs, but they're sort of based on the verb, but the culmination of the skillful qualities. So there's this idea of refinement, of effort as we move through this. So that is the closest we get to a definition. But if you wander around in the Pali Canon, it shows up in an awful lot of other places. Effort, well, and I just brought that out with the 37 factors. This is what so much of the practice is built on. There's obviously the interplay with the other factors of the path. View, when we spent a couple of weeks talking about view, there was a lot in there about skillful and unskillful, and practicing the discernment to discriminate between, the discernment to identify what's skillful and what's unskillful, and to be iterating on that and cultivating the one and not the other. That's an awful lot of what this is about. Right intention or right resolve, we talked about that being to do with abandoning sensual pleasure, becoming and non-becoming. And there's a sense of, so there's the resolve, but then there's the desire to actually act on that resolve. And that moves us into effort. So effort is a natural follower and is naturally tied in with resolve. It's taking that resolve and turning it into action. One of the things that I hadn't really thought about, but that Tanisaro points out, is the importance of investigating or looking at death in our practice in general, but in particular in thinking about right effort. We're all going to die one day. And in a sense, all our practice is about is getting ready to die. And if you approach this from the standpoint of karma, that is literally what it is. It's literally about setting the right trajectory at death. So you move down the path to Buddhahood, and then you can become a real saver of all beings. I mean, you do with that what you want, but that's the looking at death is really important. And it also puts a very clear time frame around this. And that time frame encourages another word that shows up an awful lot in the canon, which is heedfulness. So places where heedfulness shows up that are really tied up with this right effort. We don't often think of them as being so, but words that show up a lot. Goodwill and compassion. It doesn't just happen. There's real intention to cultivate goodwill and compassion. There's real intention to think about harm and not harming, ill will and not ill will, and ill will and goodwill. So harming, harmfulness, and compassion. So to shift that and make sure we're focused does require intention, and it does then require turning that intention into something and actually having the effort behind it. The idea of craving is maybe a bit strong for this, but we'll use craving. We're all used to the idea that we give up all craving, but as we move along the path, or we grow in the path, it doesn't happen without us wanting to do that, without us having a positive energy that moves us, that compels us, and that is a kind of craving. So it has to be refined and over time it becomes more subtle, and eventually it is abandoned, along with everything else, along with the path itself. But along the way, there is effort applied to and applied around this craving, this desire to engage in the path and to wake up. Two other words that have generally an unsavory flavor in our culture are pride and shame. And these are specifically used in the context of feeling appropriately good about the way you behave. So if you behave with honor and integrity and a strong center, that is something to feel good about. And pride is not an unreasonable word to use in that context. And shame, the way that Buddha in the Canon specifically talks about shame is, or one way, is to think about lying on your deathbed, and on your deathbed, do you want to reflect back on your life and say, woulda, coulda, shoulda? Or do you want to look back and say, yeah, I had a reasonably good go. I'm in a pretty good place for the next time around. That's how he approaches shame, not to be ashamed. So there are a number of different ways that these show up in these books. So there's a couple that I'm going to just talk about a little bit, and then we'll move through to the progression and wrap this up. So a couple. There is one sutra that I really like, and he talks about a city with a moat, with a guard road around it, with an army, and with a gatekeeper. So this is a metaphor for us, and you can drop all sorts of words to say what the walls, what the guardian, what the army are protecting us against, but the idea of our practice, our lives, our being something we look after in the same way that one would look after this fortress, I think is an interesting one. There's another which shows up a couple of times in slightly different flavors, and the words that are used there around effort are guarding. And what are we guarding? We're guarding our sense gates. We're watching the sense gates. And we're watching them with a view to restraining them and managing them, but also with a view to avoiding things that really we don't want to let encounter the sense gates, we don't want to engage in. Abandoning, what do we abandon? Sensual pleasures. That's the renunciation of right intention, the renunciation of sensual pleasures. Abandoning, by the way, abandoning and developing, two abandon and two develop are two of the verbs used here, and they're also two of the verbs used in the Noble Eightfold Path. So if you think about it, and I should have mentioned this earlier, the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths, if you think about it, what are we talking about? The existence of suffering, the cause of suffering. The cause of suffering should be abandoned. The cause of suffering is, on the face of it, unskillful. So we're understanding what unskillful behavior is, and then abandoning it, which are, that's like getting rid of the unskillful states, I guess. And then the other two, identifying what is the path, which is something we cultivate or we develop, which is cultivating skillful behaviors, and then ultimately waking up. So there's a really close parallel with these four and just the Four Noble Truths as a whole. So we got guarding, abandoning, developing. Specifically, it talks about developing the 7 factors of enlightenment. So it's just one of the bodies of practices that can be engaged in our work. And then specifically maintaining concentration. That maintaining concentration becomes maintaining concentration 24/7 by 365. It's just staying aware. Concentration to be present all the time. So there's a variety of different ways that's approached with those four. Sometimes a fifth one is added in, which is seeing. And there's a nuance that comes in with seeing, which is there is a tendency for us to get caught up in what happens next. Is this me? Is this what I was? Is this what I'm becoming? What is a Buddha? Does a Buddha live after he dies? And these are the unanswerable questions. So the seeing, as it's used here, and the effort around seeing is to intentionally focus seeing on looking at how we question and examine our lives. What are the things that we should examine and how? And what are the things that we should just put aside and that really aren't things to be examined? So one of the real challenges with right effort, the persistent challenges, is how much is enough? What does it look like? And I think you're probably all familiar with it. I will say the story, but I'll say it fairly quickly because the story is of the lute. So this has got one of my favorite little things in the canon where so there's this guy, I think his name was Sona, who was wandering around and he was having some challenges. He said, this is really difficult, but my family's pretty rich. So, you know what? If I just give all this practice up and I just go live my family, that'll actually be a pretty good life. I'll be pretty happy and I won't have too much suffering if I do that. And the Buddha, from a vast distance, aware of what Sona was thinking, as a strong man would flex his straight arm or would straighten his flexed arm, he just showed up next to Sona. I love it. Anyway, so then he says, so Sona, and it's the analogy of the lute, or the simile of the lute. And the simile is, if it's too slack, it doesn't work. If it's too tight or taut, it doesn't work. It's just right. So the Goldilocks thing, if it's just right, it's great. The lute has 5 strings, the lute of the time. So this is a simile for the 5 faculties, which are, what's the word for faith? Conviction, perseverance, mindfulness, meditation, and discernment. So this is a very robust framework within which to practice. And the idea of this simile is, it's not just we get them about right, but we tune one of them and we tune it to the right pitch. It's not just to where it's kind of taut and it kind of works. We tune it to the right pitch, and then we tune each of the others relative to that pitch. So we've actually got the instrument in harmony. Which is a stronger reading than is usually applied to this, but I think that's what it's actually about. So it's about really paying attention to how we tune the lute. So it's constantly adjusting. Because if you watch somebody playing a string instrument, every time there's a break, they'll just tweak it just a little bit. So we're constantly adjusting. And as we practice, we develop the discernment to recognize if we're being if this is leading us to a place of being lazy, of not really being engaged in our practice, or if we're pushing a little bit too hard. And so we learn to just push a little more or to back off. There's a 5-fold approach, which again, I know some of you have used this, but I love the similes around this as well. So the 5-fold approach, I can find it. I think it's right here. Here it is, yes. So this is used a lot of the time to talk about encountering hindrances. So things to do. Number 1, if there's a theme, as he calls it, that is not a good theme, then replace it with one that's better. As a dexterous carpenter would use a small peg to knock out a large peg. If it persists, scrutinize the drawbacks. As somebody would be horrified, humiliated, and disgusted if the carcass of a snake or a dog or a human being were hung from their neck. So scrutinizing the drawbacks of what you're doing and recognizing Now, this really is not good. If it persists, pay no mind and pay no attention. Just as somebody with good eyes, if something comes into their range and they don't want to engage with it, they close their eyes or look away. Just don't look at it. And that it takes real effort, but this is about effort. Just don't look at it. Just keep it out there. If it continues, attend to the relaxing of thought fabrication. As somebody's walking really fast, says, why am I walking so fast? Let me just slow down. Why am I walking slowly? Let me just stop and stand. Why am I standing? Let me sit down. Why am I sitting? Why don't I just lie down? So there's an intentional cultivating of relaxation, breathing into whatever's stressful and so forth. And then the last one, if it still persists, with his teeth clenched and his tongue pressed against the roof of his mouth, he should beat down, constrain, and crush his mind with awareness. So that spectrum of ways of dealing with this points at a broader structural point, which is broadly, we can apply effort to things by fabricating approaches to address something that's unskillful, fabricating something to cultivate something that is skillful, or we can cultivate an attitude of equanimity and just kind of leave things alone. Recognize it's not something I don't need to engage in, and just kind of leave it alone. Recognize it's something I should be engaging in, and just be calm with it and let it arise. So this balance between fabrication and equanimity is an interesting one. And it becomes more interesting as the practice becomes more subtle, as we become more mature in the practice. So there's this idea of becoming more refined and more subtle. The Anapanasati Sutta is a really good place to see that. You'll recall that's the one, the 16 steps. It's a mindfulness of breathing, and it starts off breathing in, breathing out, aware of the body, calming the body. Then the second tetrad is rapture, pleasure, aware of feelings, calming feelings, and so it goes on. And there's different degrees of intensity and equanimity being applied in those steps in the Anapanasati Sutta. So the Anapanasati Sutta is, in a way, it is simply a text that is the application of and the training in right effort. And it does so in a way that we can look at the level, intensity, grossness, or subtleness of our effort at any one of these 16 steps, or any gradation in there. So that's a really good way to see effort shifting, the quality and intensity of effort shifting as we work with our practice. And ultimately, we get to one of my very favorite sutras, which I will read to you, which is beyond right effort. Then a certain Devata, or it would be pronounced Devata, in the far extreme of the night, her extreme radiance lighting up the entirety of Jeta's grove, went to the Blessed One. On arrival, having bowed down to him, she stood to one side. As she was standing there, she said to him, "Tell me, dear sir, how you crossed over the flood." "I crossed over the flood without pushing forward, without staying in place." "But how, dear sir, did you cross over the flood without pushing forward, without staying in place?" "When I pushed forward, I was whirled around. When I stayed in place, I sank. And so I crossed over the flood without pushing forward, without staying in place." And there's a verse which basically recaps that. It's a rather pretty verse. So this idea of not pushing forward and not staying in place, it's a paradox. But it's a paradox that is a practice, and it's a paradox that can be held and can be engaged in. Another way that shows up is when realization happens, there is no here and there is no there. So there can be no coming and no going. So there's no pushing forward and no standing still. There's no going there and there's no staying here. Ill-defined question. So that's the place where, as with all of these elements of the path, right effort is released with no standing still and no pushing forward, no standing still. So that's